like we do every year or every session, such as more money for schools, and certainly fairness in the way that the funds are allocated, which I would say is better than it used to be, but still stands some improvement. So the goal of this, just having it on the agenda, is to not just have me or whoever goes to say, well, this is what we want, but to try to get a little input from certainly from our interim superintendent and staff, as well as board members. So that's kind of what it's about. I would just say that anybody who would like to comment on that, and maybe starting with Ms. Caroline, what we are seeing in our district and what we would like to see the legislature work on.
Thank you, Mr. Chesney. You had mentioned that to me, so I am registered for the meeting as well in Region 6. Ms. Lee said that I could do it virtually or in person, so I'm figuring we can schedule out to speak. But we actually many of us just got back from Midwinter, the conference that all the executive leaders across the state attend. So we all sat through many different sessions talking about legislative priorities and greatest area of need, and you mentioned it already about funding sources for public school. I think is always a priority. So there's a lot of discussion around that. I know Dr. Barr will chime in and talk about accountability, teaching and learning, state assessments. As we she won't look at her coming straight up to that.
I mean, since you asked. I think one of the things that most schools recognize
is that our students obviously need supports differently than they did prior to the pandemic, right? Academically, social emotionally, all of those things. And with the best of intentions, the last legislative session passed House Bill 4545, which mandates a prescriptive of minutes of additional 1-on-3 instruction for students who were unsuccessful on the last STAR examination in the next grade level, even when that subject may not match up at all. You can think about U.S. history, right? And then you don't go to U.S. history, you go to geography. Well, that next year, you have to have 1-on-3 instruction in U.S. history remediation for 30 hours over the course of the school year during the academic day. That best of intentions, totally understand why the legislature would advocate for really concentrated, focused, prescriptive tutoring and support for students in response to the pandemic. The realities of implementing that have been a struggle across the state. And it has not gone unnoticed by TEA. They have also struggled with how to advise districts on how to be in compliance with House Bill 4545. So again, the intention's good, but additional flexibility within that framework would be much appreciated in the next legislative session.
Okay. And so just again, identifying specifically how that that's House Bill
4545, and it requires for every student who did not meet satisfactory performance on a STAR examination the subsequent year, they must have dedicated instruction with a tutor who's trained in a 1-to-3 ratio combination for 30 hours over the course of the school year during the school day. You may not pull them from other activities to be responsive. So if you had a student who, in light of the pandemic, struggled on math and possibly also on reading, they've got 60 hours of during the school day, 1-on-3 instruction. Again, just the staff to make that possible is a struggle. And then you can't pull them from things. So you're actually building in a different master schedule to be responsive to that, which many of our schools do already. But given the number of students needing those types of services in light of the pandemic, it certainly is a struggle for our campuses. And many were already obviously doing their own systems for tutoring and support in response to academic needs.
Okay.
It was actually part of the special session for them to address and add in flexibility, and it was on the agenda for one of the special sessions, but they just didn't get to it. So they recognized early on it was problematic, but didn't have a chance to wrap back around to it.
Well, one of the things that I've mentioned previously at one of our meetings, which I know is would be a rather big change in the way we think, but one of the things that I would like to see, and it's related to what you said, because I think it's just so difficult to try to incorporate that and still not lose ground on something else, because you can't do everything at the same time. So I'm still looking at our opportunity for summers, but if we're going to actually use that and make use of all these buildings and not making, a year-round school option, which is not going to, I don't think, ever be popular with the general population. But for those who truly are behind and need that help, I know we're doing a lot in the summer, but the state needs to fund it. The state needs to make sure that teachers want to do it, because it's going to be less stressful to be trying to do that instead of on top of everything else. So I'm hoping that will be a point of discussion. It has to be done right. It has to be not where you're going to stress out teachers even more and make them do something they don't want to do. But I think if the funding's there and you actually get kids to show up, because, wow, let me back up and say, if we were starting from scratch with making a school system, I don't know that there'd probably be a lot of people saying, well, you can't make it compulsory because what about our freedom? But we have compulsory education, and my understanding is summer's never been compulsory, and so if kids just decide they don't want to show up, they just don't show up, or the parents just don't feel any pressure. So I know I'm throwing a lot of stuff out that's pretty radical sounding, but I really think that if we're serious about, especially in light of what we've been through. By the way, if I sound funny, I just had a root canal, and it hadn't worn off yet. So anyway,
I'm so sorry.
Those of you who are watching at home, so I would like to see that. I don't know what form it would actually take, but I still frustrated that we stress our staff out so much during the school year in a catch-up mode, and then so many kids are really not, the ones that really need it are not really doing that much in the summer. They're doing something, maybe, if they show up, but so I don't know how y'all feel about that. Is that a workable thing if it's done right? I mean, if we could try to utilize our summers a little more than we do?
I think a lot of it, going back to House Bill 45, was really well done in that we remediate and we support and we scaffold and we accelerate during the school day, during the school year. It's all along the way. One punch at the end doesn't necessarily help. It has to be embedded in small chunks all along the way. I think the greater issue goes back to something you mentioned earlier, Mr. Stasny, and that's that while we do have required attendance, compulsory attendance, there aren't a lot of tools in our toolboxes for ensuring students are attending regularly. It goes back to truancy and attendance, and certainly we understand in a pandemic right now that's really a different path to follow, but when we do have the opportunity to return to some more level of normalcy, we need to address required attendance at school. All along the way, helping students in the classrooms. First instruction is the best instruction. Bottom line. That is the best instruction you're going to get. First instruction is where we need the students in the room. And in light of the pandemic, we've had a lot of absences on both sides, obviously. I think that until that issue is addressed, even if they make it required for summer, it still won't yield the outcomes that we're hoping for in terms of supporting students.
Well, any other ideas y'all have that we could pass along to the folks? Because they will have some of their legislative team there. As most of you probably know, they have people working for TASB who that's their job is to basically advocate for school districts, and in particular the school boards, because that's and as Ms. Carabine knows, that certainly TASA has its own folks that are working on these issues as well, but we don't want to overlook this option. So I guess the broader issue is just finding a way to make it possible with the proper funding and so forth to get this done whether it's during the regular school year or not. But again, I don't want to give up on the idea of trying to do at least some more during the summer.
Sure.
I assume that would be helpful if you have kids by the end of the school year and they're still not caught up, then they shouldn't really be home all summer. So, and I don't want to hog the show here, but I will mention something I have a feeling Ms. Dwayne would probably recognize quickly as an issue is mental health. I don't know what the state can do, but I don't think they're doing enough, and I think that's just something we need to throw out there too, that it's time to treat that seriously, and our students need ready access to mental health services more so than what we've got available right now, and again, I'm sure she knows more about that than I do. Randy, you want to comment on that?
Well, when we instituted T-Chat, we were super, super excited about T-Chat, and then it came to light that T-Chat, our online service through Texas A&M, is now limited to 3 to 6 sessions, and the waiting list for T-Chat is now reaching 3 to 4 weeks. So our crisis intervention that we put into place has not filled that gap. Then the second issue that just came up at the meeting last week was even with T-Chat after 6 sessions, there are no therapists to refer the children to. So you get a child, you get them through the referral system, you get them seeing a therapist on T-Chat. That therapist sees them for 3 to 6 weeks. It may take 3 weeks to get them into T-Chat. They're seen for 3 weeks, and then when we refer out, we're looking at a 3 to 6 month wait list for a therapist in the Brazos Valley. And then we start looking at funding issues. T-Chat, of course, is free. And we are using a grant for that service. But once you try to refer a student out into the community, Texas is one of a few states that did not expand Medicaid. So therefore, we have a gap between people who don't make enough money to qualify for the Affordable Care Act. And so therefore, they should be on Medicaid, but they do not qualify for Medicaid because Texas did not expand Medicaid. So mental health is a problem on both ends of funding and available resources. And there are no good answers. So the task force that we're on, we're getting ready to go and do community surveys and doing things like that. And we're facilitating some discussion with providers and stakeholders. Again, my take on that is we need to stop funding studies and start funding people, and stop funding programs and start putting bodies in chairs that can provide services. But that is a longitudinal plan. Like, that's a long-term plan. It takes us about 8 years, to facilitate that. So my comment, though, on 4545 is when 4545 was presented and given in the 30-hour requirement that was put in there, that was a non-educational base. That was a number that they kind of pulled out of the air and put it on there as to, we should do this without any evidence that 30 hours is the appropriate time or how to institute that. Did they put any teeth in that? Because I don't remember there being a consequence if we're unable to adequately provide 30 hours in a semester for a child who has been pulled without pulling them from other core curriculum. I don't remember them ever coming up with a consequence if we didn't.
That's up to the commissioner, and that's currently under review.
Okay, that's what I thought, because
They're struggling to, and even TEA has issued a grace kind of a statement in regards to hold to the spirit of it to the extent that you're able to. We understand you may not be able to hire enough trained personnel to be able to do so, but please do your best, was kind of the message.
But I think the discussion that was happening in committee on that one is not only do we have to afford grace to it, there may not be just enough hours in the day
Yes.
for a child to adequately receive this type of intensive curriculum instruction without pulling them from another core, which you're not permitted to do under 4545.
Correct. Nor can you pull them from fine arts or PE or anything else.
Right, so magically we're coming up with additional hours in a school day in order to provide a state mandate, and that's I think where we're getting a little more push is if we're unable to do that without undue stress on our staff or the child, what are they going to consequence us with?
At one point, districts did ask and said, what if a parent refuses? They don't want their child to participate, and the response from TEA is that it's compulsory and they don't have the choice or the freedom, so to speak, to refuse intervention.
So in that discussion, because I read part of that one, but it also came up with, if this is had to be offered after school, how was transportation going to be provided? And it was brought to terms that they wouldn't provide transportation. Well, then the ADA stepped in and said that you
Correct.
have to. And so I think there's a lot of fighting about implementation.
One nice thing that TEA did this year as part of a transition into 45-45, and Mr. Stasny, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about summer school. They allowed the hours for summer school to count towards that requirement with parent permission. And so that did help. So students there was some flexibility with the ratios and the scheduling. It really becomes a problem with arranging that rotation of students at a 1-to-3 ratio at any given time that's documented, tracked, and can be produced as evidence when requested. But you're right, Mrs. Duane, they have not at this point come up with interventions for districts who fail to meet that for every student. And at this point, they've asked us to do our best in light of the pandemic.
And so then I would put forth that we do our best in light of the pandemic and on the air of the health of our students and our staff.
Yes, ma'am.
And that if there comes to be a consequence for us not doing something, then we'll take that up at that time. But our staff is doing all they can.
And they truly are. And honestly, much of this was in place already, perhaps not at the 30 hours, 1-to-3 ratio throughout the year, but every campus produces a plan for targeted supports for students through Branching Minds and through all of the other resources that we have. It would be nice, though, if the legislature would go ahead and revise some of that statute to give that flexibility and autonomy back to campuses and districts.
I completely agree. And, like Fran said, the 30 hours being pulled out of the air, I'd say that's not very student-centered. There are some students who will require maybe less than that and others who might require more.
Yep.
And so giving that autonomy back to the professionals, I think would be a step in the right direction. The other things I thought of, Mr. Stasny, we passed a bond last year, and it was very frustrating for us and many other school districts across the state to be required to put the language that this will result in a tax increase that in our case was not truthful, but was still required by law. So I believe in transparency, and that we should be required to put whatever that statement is, that, the impact on taxpayers. But it was not helpful, and we saw a huge decrease in the number of bonds that were passed last year across the state as a result of that. I contend it's because of that language. So that's problematic to me. The other thing is that even in a pandemic, there has been an increase in the number of things that we're required to do, from reading academies to teacher incentive allotments, that these are not all bad ideas, but implementation is problematic when we're trying to do all the other things we need to do. So I get that legislators want things to happen overnight, but we need more time to implement many of these.
I want to add to your bond. We talked about this at TASA and some of the meetings that I attended. Besides the language about the tax rate, the different propositions requiring you to do one separate for athletics or natatoriums or fine arts, et cetera. Even if they would adjust it for repairs or renovations, so that doesn't have to stand alone as a separate proposition, that would be very helpful, because you can look across the state and see the number of propositions that failed, and some of them were not a new build, it was simply renovations. So, it would be wonderful if they could streamline that, because that hurt a lot of districts and widespread across the state.
Well, I'll certainly concur. That was on my list to mention, was the separation of the bonds. And I understand why they did it, but it seems like in doing that, they penalized more than they prevented. And the same thing with the bond language. But I'll come back to our healthy debate on summer school. And I think probably my challenge is, how do you find that same blend of what Dr. Ybarra is referring to and you? And I won't sit here and say that I'm for pro year-round school, except for the fact that I am pro at looking at it like a tri-semester, where there is an extra semester there in the summer that, and maybe it starts that kids can opt out of that, summer semester. How do they opt out? They meet all of their, end of course requirements, and then they don't have to attend that middle, or that over term. But, I've always been a big fan of that strategy where there's more of Christmas break type or holiday break type between the semesters, each semester, on a tri-semester basis, where you have 2 to 3 weeks to catch up for that, for whatever that period is as well. You have some breathing room and you have some catch-up room. So earlier when I mentioned year-round school, it wasn't kids are in school 365 days a year, same vacation time, but just more spread out. And before the travel agents start calling, I don't think that's gonna get us anywhere, but that's at least conceptually a good place to be, where you're not just selectively picking out those kids that really need it, but you're allowing kids that succeed to actually opt out of it and not have to attend. So it kind of flips that area. And the other thing that I'll just add that's kind of more school board related, specifically for TASB, not legislative, but it has to do with legislative, is one of our goals as school board members and as a school board is to, in our role as a entity, is to stay as apolitical as possible. It is to serve our students, serve our communities, and do that regardless of what the current wind's going. And certainly the events that happened at the national school board level totally went against all of that this past summer. And, and I know TASB's taken a half step back and said that they're going to look at it, but I, quite frankly, feel like they need to do even a little bit more than that. Just, the idea of having meetings that, parents are deemed, terrorists is just asinine to me. It's insane. And to know that the National School Board was involved in creating all that language and creating that, I think the Texas school boards should have a stronger stance against those particular comments.
A lot of state associations withdrew, and to my knowledge, Texas has not. Ironically, her name escapes me for the moment, but I had personal conversations with the president who came from TASB, and I never dreamed that she would be involved in that sort of thing, but she was definitely involved, and that was just horrific that that kind of message was sent. And by being a member, it was sort of like, well, the TASB organization was involved with that. Now, you probably know that the current executive director of TASB has come out with a very strong, I would say, condemnation.
Right.
So it's not like, let bygones be bygones, but I would agree that there probably should be something discussed and promoted at grassroots about, we can't let this happen again. It's destructive of our image and our purpose as public schools.
All right. Thank you. And with that, we will move down into business services. And the one action item that we have is consideration and possible action to select the delivery method providing the best value for the elementary school playground shade structures.
Okay, thanks for having me today. I'm here to ask for board approval to utilize an interlocal purchasing cooperative as the method of procurement for the shade structures for the elementary schools. That was deemed a project in the 2020 bond. Our policy states that the procurement method for construction projects valued over $50,000 is competitive seal proposal. So this would go away from competitive seal proposal and into the interlocal purchasing cooperative. We will still get competitive bidding through the co-ops. It'll just allow us to use contractors that have already been vetted and they've already actually competitively bid to be on these co-ops as well. But it will give us the opportunity to reach out to these. It's a pretty specific project that not everyone does because there's engineering and design for the different shade structures for each and every campus. They'll be different and could be two separate designs and engineering on the same campus depending on the playground and everything. So bringing in these more specialized companies, it will allow us to go directly to them for better pricing versus competitively bid out. We would have general contractors and everything else involved, which is nothing wrong with general contractors, but then we'd have to pay their markup and everything else to run the projects, where we could go directly to the source through this. And we will still utilize all of our scoring methods, all of our reference requests and reference checks that we utilize in the competitive seal process. We'll just do it through the purchasing cooperative instead.
Which elementary schools are we?
The bond is slated to have 2 shade structures at every elementary.
Okay.
Then once we go down and we find a contractor, we will start prioritizing which campuses that we can get done this summer. We can't get them all done this summer, but start prioritizing those at that point.
We also had a shade structure going on at Bryan High School, I think over the
Yes, over that
courtyard area.
over that courtyard area. That one will be lumped into the Bryan High project
Okay.
with the GC because we're going to do all of their facility assessment items at one point, and that includes that one.
So you say each one is gonna look different at each elementary?
Just depends on the playground. With not necessarily colors, but how it is structured to be able to cover the entire playground that it's over.
So that's gonna affect the cost, because each one might be, little
Some
bit
could
different
be
in price.
over what we budgeted and some could be under, but the hope is that at the end of it, they're all under budget as a total. But we plan for 2 at every campus, and some campuses already have 1 or 2. So the campuses that already have 1, we wouldn't add 2, and now they have 3. At the end of it, every campus would have 2.
And Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've done an inventory of every elementary school, looking at the configuration of their play equipment, so we know
Yes.
the size, the scope, and the quantity that they have or may not have.
Yes. I don't know off the top of my head how much each school has, but then we're also going to utilize Google Earth and sit down with each principal. If they have 4 separate playgrounds on a campus or 3, which ones are a priority for the principal to have a shade structure over versus me saying, hey, this one, and the one they use the most is not covered. So I'm going to sit down with each of them to verify which ones they would like covered if they have more than 2 playgrounds.
And then the engineering aspect of the topography, the ground under each one may be different from one side of town to the other. So that'll affect the cost.
And the wind loads that they'll have to be able to take on as well.
I move approval that the board select the interlocal purchasing cooperative method of procurement of construction services as providing the best value for the elementary school playground shade structures, and authorize the superintendent or designee to take all action for the procurement of such services pursuant to statute and board policy.
Second.
Well done.
We should use.
I have a motion by Dr. Harlan and a second by Ms. Dwayne. If there's no further discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries as moved. The board will now convene in closed session to discuss the following items as allowed by Texas Government Code, Chapter 551, 072, and 074. No voting will take place in closed meeting. Any action the board wishes to take as a result of discussion in closed session will take place after the board reconvenes in the open meeting. It is now 12:32. The board reconvened in open session at 1:34. No action was taken in closed session, and if there's no further comments, we are adjourned.